We are continuing in our series in Romans through 2024, and I'm kind of ready to be done with chapters 1 and 2. Because 1, 2, and 3 really are building up a case for our need for grace, building up some conviction in our lives. If you can study 1, 2, and 3 of Romans and not have a greater awareness of your own sin, then you're reading it wrong. The gospel, we've said, is a diagnosis and it's a cure, but before it can be a cure, it needs to be a diagnosis. And so Paul in Romans 1 through 3 is diagnosing us. He's putting us all in the same circle. He's talking about the unrighteous and the self-righteous, but making it clear no matter what your story is, God's grace is what you need in Jesus. It is your only hope. And we're getting there. We're getting to grace. But I don't want each week as we go through 1 through 3, I don't want to leave you feeling shame and guilt because grace is coming, right? Like Jesus loved us while we were still sinners, Romans 5 says, and he came and he died for us to make us new. So we're going to celebrate that, but we're still in chapter 2. We still have some diagnosis left to do. A couple months ago, I was on my way home from work and decided to stop at a restaurant, pick up some soup. It was a cold winter night, then pick up some soup for my wife and I. And as I was driving down Shelbyville Road, I was gonna stop at Panera Bread and I saw another business I hadn't noticed before, and it seemed that this business only sold soup. And I'm like, well, I'll try that. Pulled in the parking lot and I walked into this place of business. That's Buff City soap. But I thought it said soup. I mean, my eyes aren't great, but I would also say that when you are hungry for soup and you're thinking soup and you're wanting soup, that soap looks like soup. Could have happened to anybody. And so I walked in, and my first thought was not, I'm in a soap place. My first thought was, why does this soup place sell so much soap? Like, it took me a minute. I didn't realize, and in context, Buff City makes more sense with soap than with soup. Like Buff City Soup sounds like a restaurant in violation of a lot of different health codes and public decency laws, right? Like Buff City Soup, not so great. But I thought it was soup. So I walk in there and I should have laughed at myself and just kind of walked out. But I felt like the only other person in there, the lady who worked there, could see right through me. In my mind, she's thinking, I bet that moron walked in here looking for soup. And so I started shopping around. Like, hey, do you know where the vanilla lavender scent is? What goes good with broccoli and cheese? Right, like that. And I started thinking, okay, maybe I could turn this embarrassing moment into a romantic gesture. Maybe I could get some soap and some soup and go home with a combination of soap and soup for my wife. But then I start thinking, no, she'll see through that. She'll be like, did you stop at the soap place to get soup? And end up like I could see the whole thing, that she would recognize. So the whole story kind of represents my inclination to put out the best version of myself. My inclination to worry about how people perceive me, wanting to manipulate a situation so that I look as good as possible, wanting to take mistakes and failures and present them in such a way that are disguised and makes people impressed with me. And I would say that all of us have this innately with us, inside of us, that we care about what people see. We put a lot of attention on the outside. We worry about keeping up appearances. We want to minimize our failures and mistakes and disguise them, manipulate the situation to make ourselves look as good as possible. All of this is self-righteousness, and it can be especially prevalent within the church. There's something about church, religion, there's something about moralism that creates that and makes it even stronger within us. And so in Romans 2, Paul is writing to address this spirit of self-righteousness, because it's not just unrighteous sinners who need the grace of Jesus, it's the self-righteous sinners that need the grace of Jesus. And if you haven't noticed, he spends more time talking to the self-righteous than the unrighteous. And here's why. It's because when you're self-righteous, it's harder to see your sin. Self-righteousness blinds you to your own self-righteousness. Self-righteousness tries to convince you, I'm good. And the way people perceive me is really how I am with God. It equates our eternal standing with our outward appearance. And so Paul addresses all of that. And in chapter 2, starting in verse 17. Now you, if you call yourself a Jew, if you've kind of grown up with this religious heritage, if you're a church person who's read the Bible, who's studied the scriptures, if you rely on the law and boast in God, look how I've kept the rules, look at the family I came from, check out my church attendance record. If you know his will and approve of what is superior because you're instructed by the law, if you're convinced that you are a guide for the blind, a light for those who are in the dark, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of little children, because you have in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth, if you're putting your confidence in your religion and in your knowledge, your theological knowledge, if you're finding that you feel superior to others because of your spiritual past, what's been passed down to you, then I've got some things I want to say to you. And he's going to warn us here about self-righteousness and hypocrisy. So for context, let's remember that he's writing this to Christians in the Church of Rome that are split up into two groups. You've got the Jews who grew up with a very moralistic approach. They knew the Old Testament, they'd studied the scriptures, they'd kept the traditions, the law of Moses, the 10 Commandments, they had that sign in their front yard, the whole thing. The Gentiles, not so much. The Gentiles grew up in Rome and they had this very secular, very hedonistic culture and view of life, and you bring these two groups together to make up the church, and there was this tendency to have this varsity and JV approach, where the Jews feel like, well, because, I mean, no offense, Gentiles, but because of our background, because of what we know, because of what's been passed down to us, because of our heritage, we've got the VIP seats over here. And they felt superior because of their knowledge, because of the way they had been brought up. And so Paul's addressing the self-righteousness by way of review. In chapter 1, he talks about the unrighteous, and he uses the pronoun they. They are greedy, they are sexually immoral, they are lovers of pleasure, they. And then in chapter 2, he switches it and he says you. About the time the Jews start applauding, like, yeah, tell them, let them have it, they need to hear it. Paul switches pronouns from they to you so you know that you are they. We are all in the same sin circle, and his warning is against self-righteousness. So how do you know if you're on this self-righteous scale? Here's a little test. I want you to think of a person that you're in a close relationship of some kind with. Maybe it's a sibling or a friend or a roommate. I mean, you know this person pretty well. If you're married, just make it your spouse, okay? Now, you have that person in mind, okay? If you're sitting next to them, don't make eye contact, just have them in your mind. Now, I want you to think of 3 things that person needs to do different. 3 areas that person needs to grow in. 3 things about them that need to be addressed. Things that need to change. So you got the person? If you got the person, you should think of the 3 things. Just 3. Now, I want you to think of yourself in that relationship. If you're married with your spouse, maybe it's a friend, a coworker, what are 3 things that you could do different? What are 3 areas that you need to grow in? And what 3 ways do you need to change? See, a self-righteous person has no problem with the first part of that test. They're good at seeing what needs to change in other people, but not so good at recognizing it when it comes to their own life. Jesus said, why are you looking at the speck of dust in your neighbor's eye when you got a plank in your own eye? They're good at recognizing what somebody else needs to address, but not so good at recognizing that in their own lives. Another sign of self-righteousness is that you love to compare yourself to other people. When you're trying to prove your own righteousness, when you're trying to come up with the case for your own goodness, your own moralism, the way you do that, consciously or not, is you compare yourself to other people and you feel better about you because of what mess they're in. And for this reason, when someone has some kind of a moral fall in some ways, like you say on the outside, oh, I hate to hear that. But inside, you're like, yeah, it's not my story. I didn't do that. I'd never do that. And you feel better about yourself by comparing yourself to other people. Another sign of a self-righteous person is that you get offended and you stay offended. You stay offended. Like somebody said something or they did something, and then offense initially was natural. but you've hung on to it because you don't deserve it. In your mind, it's not fair that you would be treated that way. In your mind, your offense is warranted, so you just stay offended. Just stay offended. It's a sign of self-righteousness. You play a part of the victim. A self-righteous person, when they do something or they say something that they know is wrong or sinful, the way they get around feelings of guilt or conviction is they blame somebody else for it. And so sometimes they'll rewrite history to get them to the place where it's okay for them to do what they did, because that way they can still look in the mirror and feel good about themselves. A self-righteous person craves approval and likes. They want to always be patted on the back. And so Paul is addressing this spirit. He's warning these church people about self-righteousness. The Message paraphrases Romans 2:17 and following in a way that I think is helpful. He says, if you're brought up Jewish, don't assume that you can lean back in the arms of your religion, feeling smug because you're an insider to God's revelation, a connoisseur of the best things of God, informed on the latest doctrines, acting like you're better than other people. I've got a special word of caution for you who are sure you have it all together. Because you know God's revealed word inside and out, and you feel qualified to guide others through their blind alleys and dark nights and confused emotions to God. I've got a special word for those of you who think, I've got this thing figured out. I've got a special word for those of you who look around and think, well, maybe there's some things that I could address, but at least I'm not like this person over here. Special word of caution. Number one, don't put your confidence in your religious tradition. Do not find confidence in the fact that you grew up perhaps going to church, parents who tried to instill faith in you, or grandparents who made sure you knew it was important. Like, that's a beautiful gift, unless that's what you've put your confidence in. Unless you think that is what determines your standing with God, then that gift is not so much a gift, because it's making you think things are okay with you and God, when in reality, things are okay with your parents and God or your grandparents and God. Like, that standing does not get passed down. You don't get to inherit that from them. It has to be your own. And sometimes what happens to those of us who grew up in church is we start to feel fine about ourselves because we've gone through the motions for so long. And we've gotten so good at the outward appearance that we've fooled not only the people around us, but we fool ourselves. A number of years ago, I read the autobiography of the tennis player Andre Agassi. The book is called Open. And for years, Andre Agassi was one of the top tennis players in the world, turned pro at 16, won 8 Grand Slams over his 20-year career. But what I found interesting in the book is that it's not what he wanted. And he talks about what he calls his deep ambivalence towards tennis. It was ambivalent. It was indifferent. He didn't care. And what happens with ambivalence is it has a way of turning to resentment and bitterness. And he describes this scene in his life where his demanding father pushed him into the sport. He says, I never chose this life, and I resented it. For a long time, I resented it. My dad decided I was going to be number one in the world before I was even born. And he writes about a practice session he had with his dad when he was age 7. My arm feels like it's about to fall off. I ask my dad, how much longer, Pops? And no answer. I get an idea. Accidentally on purpose, I hit a ball high up over the fence. I catch it on the rim of the racket so it sounds like a misfire. My father sees the ball leave the court. He curses. He stomps out of the yard. I now have 4.5 minutes to catch my breath. It wasn't his choice. He had to reach a place in his life where he chose it and he wanted it for himself. But because of the way it was passed down to him, for a long time he was ambivalent, and then he was resentful, because it needed to be his choice. Now, you wouldn't have known that if you saw him practice, if you would have looked at him out on the court, if you would have seen him win a championship, but he was good. Like, the performance was something he was good at. Pretending was something he was good at, but it wasn't who he was on the inside, and that eventually wore him out, and that ambivalence turned to resentment, and this is where some of you are at spiritually. Like, you are good at going through the motions. It's been passed down to you. You know what's expected of you, and so you're listening to this message right now. But if you had it your way, you wouldn't really be here. Like, you're here because you feel pressured to. You're here because it's what's expected of you. But it's not real. Like you sit here in church and you pray, but when's the last time you prayed on your own? I mean, really prayed. And when we read scripture, you read scripture, if you're in a group or you're a part of a table at Man Challenge, like, yeah, okay, you read the Bible, you study it there, but do you study it on your own? Do you read the Bible for yourself? And so we get good at going through the motions. We come here and we worship. We know the words to the songs, but then we don't worship in our own hearts. We don't worship on our own. It's just this performance. And it's time to choose it for yourself. It's time to own it for yourself. Don't put your confidence in your religious heritage. I would say to some of you parents, you're carrying a weight these days because your child, perhaps adult child, hasn't chosen it for themselves. And you want them to choose it for themselves, and you keep forcing, and you're frankly a little concerned about what other people think because your kid's not with you and they're not sitting next to you, and you're not sure what path they're gonna go on. I would just tell you this as a pastor, it's better for them to go on a path and choose it for themselves than to spend the next 30 years going through the motions, pretending, putting on a good performance, meeting all your expectations, but none of it's real. And so our prayer would be that you would choose it for yourself, that you wouldn't put your confidence in what was passed down to you. You could be grateful for it, but you make it your own. One of the things I often address is a conversation where someone comes and they'll say, hey, my parents had me baptized when I was a baby. That's fine, right? Like, that's good. Or they'll say, I was baptized when I was little. Like, I kind of remember it. I think I was doing it to make my parents happy, or some friends were getting baptized, so I did it too, but that's fine, right? And I would just tell you, it needs to be your decision. It's your commitment. It's your faith. That does not take away from what your parents' intent was. Like, I love the fact that they wanted to, from the beginning of your life, make sure to commit you to God. They wanted to make sure to prioritize your relationship with God. That is beautiful. But you need to reinforce that. Like, that has to be your decision. Somebody else can't make that decision for you. And so in 5 weeks, when we have Easter, we're gonna have a time of celebration in our Easter service where we celebrate some baptisms. And I wanna challenge some of you who have felt ambivalent towards spiritual things to start preparing your hearts these next 5 weeks during Lent, that you're gonna make it your own. That your faith, though it seems to have died and you're just going through the motions, that it would be resurrected on Resurrection Sunday, that you would be baptized, that you would commit your life and your heart to God, that you wouldn't go through the motions anymore, that you would make that decision for yourself. Don't put your confidence in what's been passed down to you. Be grateful for it, but make it your own. I would also warn those of you who have become comfortable in your religion, those of you who think you've got it all together. Secondly, I would say, don't put your confidence in external appearances. Don't think that because you look good on the outside, that makes you right with God on the inside. You might fool a lot of other people, but don't let that fool yourself into thinking that you and God are good when there's some stuff in here that needs to be addressed. Earlier this week, I took a selfie, and I put that picture into this app that promised to generate these AI-generated pictures that would make me look better within seconds. So I took the selfie, and then it generated these AI pictures I want to show you here. There's this one. And there's me. Yeah. And then that's my favorite. We live in a world where we're pretty good at this. We have a lot of opportunities to try to appear better than we really are. We have a lot of filters that we can apply to make ourselves seem more impressive than what's on the inside. I sent those to my wife. I thought she might get a kick out of them, and she thought they were funny. And then I went home, I'm like, then why is picture number 3 your screensaver? Why, what happened? I'm just kidding, she did not do that. She did not make that her screensaver. But we do versions of this that maybe aren't quite as obvious, but are just as manipulative, where we are constantly trying to find our worth and identity, trying to find confidence, not in what's real, but in what we can convince other people of.